Hey, RetconRaider here. Well, I've got a narrow opening in my schedule, so let's put that to good use, shall we? Today, let's go ahead and finally round out our analysis of design document number 15, the Bloomfield Space Center. It's been a long time coming, but looking at the numbers on part 3 of this series, I'm glad to see that there's still a modest audience that's keen on hearing me ramble about Fallout Van Buren. It's actually pretty impressive, honestly, given that at this point, development on Van Buren was officially cancelled almost 2 decades ago. That said, I would just like to say thanks for still being into this stuff, and thus giving me an excuse to keep revisiting it. And special thanks, of course, to the Raiders, the fine folks who help make these pet projects of mine slightly more financially viable on YouTube. Revenant, Alois, Anerdinwarpaint, Antonio Hernandez, Dragon Matrix 7, Exsellsior, Gottlieb, Kazorm, Lima, Nathan Welch Jr., Valinrook. You guys know who you are. Anyway, let's get started. Now, first up, I've had a few people ask me, why split up the quest content like this? Why not just talk about all the potential Bloomfield quests in a single video and be done with it? Well, first of all, that video was already running too long. Trying to tag the Hermes XIII launch arc on top of the Rusty Hook content would have put it over the hour mark. As much as I do love rambling, I do at least make a token effort towards keeping these videos from getting too crazy. That aside, aside from both taking place in the same location, the Rusty Hook arc has almost nothing to do with the Hermes XIII launch arc. The Rusty Hooks appear to have been primarily designed as a late Act 1 mid-game challenge that would ultimately serve as the player's introduction to the Bloomfield Space Center. In fact, the impression I get is that it was almost something of a red herring intended to trick the player into thinking that that was all the location had to offer. As with many locations in the Fallout setting, Van Buren included, it was a fairly standard post-apocalyptic scenario. In this case, a desperate gang of raiders set against a fantastical old-world backdrop. It wasn't until Act 2 that the player would finally realize how important that particular background scenery actually was, and at that point, the Rusty Hooks would already be largely irrelevant. In fact, depending on how the player approached the gang in the first place, there's a pretty good chance that they would already be dead or otherwise dealt with by the time the player returned. The only ways the gang would still be there is if the player had arranged to depose Kyle and replace him with a new leader, either Bear or themselves. The gang would also still be there if the player had just never visited Bloomfield at all during Act 1. A little unlikely, but it does appear to have at least been theoretically possible. Looking at the overall flow of the main quest during Act 1, the only reason the player would have to travel to Bloomfield during Act 1 was if Jillian McKinley went there. She was one of the Tibbetts prison escapees that the player was required to collect to actually complete the first half of the game. If left to her own devices after being rescued from the reservation, she would travel to Bloomfield to reunite with the Rusty Hooks, and in that case, the player would be forced to follow her there. Otherwise, the location was entirely avoidable, at least until the second half of the game. Regardless, however, the gang's presence was largely incidental during Act 2. Whether or not they were there would have very little impact on how things played out with the Hermes XIII. At best, they could provide the player with a few supplies and some interesting bits of lore, and at worst, they would just once again serve as a relatively minor obstacle that the player would have to overcome to prepare the Hermes XIII for launch. Now, that said, it is important to highlight the exact changes that would take place at Bloomfield during the second half of the main campaign. As mentioned in earlier videos, during Act 1, the player would be preoccupied with curing the new plague and shutting down Odysseus at the Tibbetts prison facility. While they would have had some incidental contact with Dr. Victor Presper and his minions, both at Boulder Dome and potentially in the ruins of Denver, they wouldn't actually understand just what Presper was up to until their confrontation with Odysseus was resolved. At that point, however, it would already be too late to confront Presper directly, While the player was preoccupied with Odysseus and the new plague, Presper would have already collected what he needed from Boulder Dome and the Tibbetts prison facility, and then traveled via his personal train, the General, to a stretch of abandoned track somewhere near Hoover Dam. From there, he would travel by foot to Bloomfield. He would use codes and data collected from Boulder Dome and the Tibbetts computer network to bypass launchpad security, prep the Hermes 14 for launch, and then fly to BOM-1. At that point, the only remaining obstacles he would have to overcome would be to figure out the appropriate launch codes for the station's remaining nuclear arsenal. It is interesting to note here, though, that while Act 1 involved the player having to deal with multiple critical mission timers, mostly revolving around the new plague, Act 2 didn't seem to have any timers, at least not until the very, very end. Presper would end up spending the majority of Act 2 up in space, abstractly trying to hack the missile launch systems off-screen. But no matter how long it took the player to actually get up there, he wouldn't succeed until the player actually docked with BOM-1. At that point, Presper would suddenly crack the system and the missile launch countdown would begin, thus making the final confrontation with Presper as absurdly climactic as possible. In the short term, however, Presper's exodus from Earth would present the player with a new series of fetch quests to complete and obstacles to overcome. The player would learn about Presper's plans during or after their vaguely defined confrontation with Odysseus, which would ultimately end up pointing them towards the Bloomfield Space Center, or back towards Bloomfield if they had already been there before. Upon arriving at Bloomfield, they would discover that a few key things had changed in their absence. First, the Hermes 14 would now be gone. That's how Presper got up to BOM-1. Second, the launch pad and the one remaining shuttle, the Hermes 13, would now be under heavy guard. 4 of Presper's men, generic former NCR soldiers, would be keeping a watchful eye on it, potentially supported by any remaining launchpad laser Gatling turrets or security robots that the player had not disabled during their previous visits. If the Rusty Hooks were still present, they would have worked out a tense truce with Presper and his men. Realizing that they were hopelessly outclassed, Bear or Kyle would have ordered the gang to stay away from the launch pad, maintaining an uneasy coexistence with these heavily armed intruders. It's theoretically possible that the player could have somehow used this to their advantage, but unfortunately the documents don't really go into that. What the document does make clear, however, is that the very first and most basic step of prepping the Hermes 13 for launch would be to clear and secure the launch pad. At its most basic, this was a challenging but very straightforward combat encounter. The 5 turrets and 4 sentry robots were likely to be fairly trivial threats at this late stage in the game. They were only listed as level 8 opponents. Victor Presper's men, on the other hand, were clearly intended to be endgame threats, level 20 and heavily outfitted with combat armor, grenades, and high-powered rifles. Assuming that the player didn't just go in with guns blazing, which was certainly a valid approach, there were a number of ways that the player could end up making this fight a little easier to handle. As mentioned in the previous videos, the security network on the launch pad ran separate from the Bloomfield Space Center's main computer and power networks. The computer controlling the turrets, and the generator keeping them powered, were concealed in a small security room beneath the launch pad. With 100 or more points in stealth, the player could theoretically sneak their way into that room and access both the security computer and secondary generator. From there, they could then use the appropriate security codes acquired from Boulder Dome or the reservation, and they could shut down the turrets. They could also use this computer to shut down the facility's electric fence, though it's unclear what purpose that would actually serve. If they lacked the proper codes, they could also hack the computer with 100+ points in science, or they could simply destroy the secondary generator. In either case, this would disable the 5 laser Gatling turrets, but it would not disable the security robots or Victor Presper's men. If the player destroyed the generator, that would also likely alert Presper's men to their presence, forcing a now slightly easier but still difficult physical confrontation. More tech-savvy players, however, could make slightly better use of the turrets by instead reprogramming them to fire on the other guards. The design document seems to imply that doing this would automatically destroy both the security robots and Presper's men, despite the fact that the turrets would be drastically outgunned, essentially circumventing the fight entirely, and presenting a way for non-combat or pacifist characters to bypass an otherwise combat-focused encounter. Regardless of how they accomplished it, once the launchpad was secured, the player would then be able to proceed with prepping the Hermes 13 for launch. This brings us to restoring and accessing the mission control room. Now this is the one area of the Hermes 13 launch arc that does somewhat overlap with the Rusty Hook's quest arc. Given that the gang uses the command building as their home, and that Kyle specifically uses the mission control room as his personal quarters, they might object to the player poking around in there. That could be resolved in a wide variety of ways, as outlined extensively in the previous video, so we won't really worry about it here. Of more important note, however, is that the mission control computer wouldn't function properly until the player restored the facility's main power generator back to at least 60% efficiency. There is a little ambiguity here, because Presper would have theoretically already done this in order to launch the Hermes 14, but even if he didn't, it was relatively simple to accomplish. It would only take a modest amount of tech skills to raise the generator efficiency to the required level. If the player couldn't do it themselves, it could still be accomplished by numerous tech-savvy companions, such as Arcade Gannon or Otto Steed. It could even be accomplished by members of the Rusty Hooks, like Jillian McKinley or Sid, though Sid would only be able to do this if he was first given a skill book to help bump up his relevant skills. It is worth briefly noting that while the generator only needs to be running at about 60% efficiency to gain proper access to the mission control computer, the generator could be restored as high as 85% efficiency. Again, the exact benefits of doing this are pretty ambiguous. The document mainly implies that this would give the player access to more lore info about Bloomfield, the B.O.M.B program, and Hermes 13. I do have an interesting bit of speculation there, but we'll come back to that a little later. Even after restoring the power, the player would still require proper codes to actually access the mission control computer, but this was a fairly trivial obstacle. The proper codes could be found at the Boulder Dome, but the player could also just hack their way into the system with a fairly modest 50+ science skill. This would give them access to some more general lore and basic mission control functionality, including access to the Hermes 13 cockpit, which could otherwise only be accomplished with an electronic lockpick. More importantly, it would also provide the player with what would essentially amount to a checklist of the numerous other MacGuffins and plot devices that they would need to collect to actually finish prepping the shuttle for launch. Now, I should take a quick detour here to really stress that the specifics of the Hermes 13 launch quest are pretty vague. It's clear that the overall intention here was to require the player to travel all over the world map and revisit several key locations, presumably to ensure that they completed some of the more prominent, location-specific quest arcs in places like Boulder Dome, Mesa Verde, and the Reservation. It's obvious that the developers were still in the process of hammering out the specific details of what exactly would be required and where the player would need to go. For example, the document makes reference to at least 4 distinctly different sets of codes, with suggestions for where they might be located. Damian Folletto suggested that the codes for the launchpad security, for example, could be acquired at either Boulder Dome or the Reservation, or simply bypassed with a 100+ science skill. He suggested that the access codes for the mission control computer could be acquired at Boulder Dome as well, but again noted that this could be bypassed with a 50+ science skill. There are vague references to yet another code being required to shut down Bloomfield's main generator, but it's unclear if this code would have actually been in the game at all. It was presented more as a justification as to why the player couldn't simply shut down the generator long enough to bypass the turrets on the launchpad. That aside, even if the player could get those codes, Folletto took pains to clearly indicate that the turrets ran on a separate power grid anyway, so shutting down the main facility power would actually be counterproductive because they'd just have to turn it back on again when they were ready to launch the Hermes 13. One code that the player would be absolutely required to track down, however, was the Hermes 13 launch code. Folletto suggested that this code could only be found in Dr. Willem Clark's personal computer deep beneath the Ghoul Run reservation, and no option was presented to bypass this particular requirement. That means that in order to actually launch the Hermes 13, the player would first need to travel to the reservation and complete the main endgame quest there. We've already talked about the reservation pretty extensively in previous videos, so we won't really get into it here, but suffice to say, the player could fight their way through Clark's forces, ally with one of his opponents to overthrow him, or even work out an uneasy truce with Clark himself to acquire the necessary code. As insane as he was, Clark had actual first-hand knowledge of the pre-war bomb program, and he would recognize the potential threat that Presper was posing to his own plot to overthrow humanity. In fact, rather amusingly, it's even implied in one of the Boulder Dome end slides that if the player foils Presper's plot, but doesn't foil Clark's as well, then Dr. Clark would eventually succeed in his place. The player would have essentially prevented one mad scientist from conquering the region, only to hand control over to an entirely different mad scientist. Just goes to show that diplomacy is not always the most ideal solution. Regardless of how the player acquired or bypassed the various codes, their next big hurdle would be to get the mission control room properly staffed. They would need an appropriately tech-savvy ground crew to help them make it to Bomb 1 safely, and things get really vague here. The document implies that the player could recruit people from one of the various in-game factions, the Brotherhood, the NCR, or even the Reservation, but that in doing so, they would essentially be handing control of the facility to that faction. Failing that, they could also staff the mission control room with appropriately learned companions, such as Arcade Gannon. But this, of course, would necessitate leaving those companions behind during the final mission. One rather peculiar detail here is that the only person the design document mentions by name as being suitable for this task is the mysterious Dr. Huxley. Dr. Huxley is not mentioned in any of the other documents. In fact, the only place I could find any mention of him in relation to Van Buren is in a partial interview between Chris Avallone and No Mutants Allowed. There, Avallone shares basic details of the original main story arc intended for Fallout Van Buren, one that differs significantly from the story that actually seemed to make it into the unfinished design documents. In the original pitch, Dr. Victor Presper was actually a pre-war scientist who survived the Great War by cryogenically freezing himself beneath Boulder Dome. When he awoke, he was disgusted by what he saw of post-nuclear society, and used his vast pre-war knowledge to infiltrate the NCR and put his genocidal plot into motion, under the pseudonym of Dr. Matthias Huxley. It's possible that with the hefty revisions made to Presper's original backstory, Matthias Huxley was actually turned into a separate character entirely. Given context, it's probably safe to assume that he was probably meant to be a high-ranking NCR scientist, possibly one that the player would have met at Fort Abandon. Unfortunately, given the lack of reliable design documents for Fort Abandon or the main quest, that's something we may just never end up knowing for sure. Of course, just staffing the mission control room wouldn't be enough. Again, while the details are pretty hazy, it's possible that the player would then also be required to repair the Bloomfield comms array so that the ground crew could actually monitor and communicate with the Hermes 13 during the trip to Bomb 1. This is largely just speculation on my part, but it would certainly make sense. I noted in the previous videos that the document specifically mentions the player could repair the Bloomfield comms array, but that it never actually specified why the player would want to do that. While it's also possible that restoring communications was just intended to help facilitate other quests, calling Argos to collect Julian McKinley, for example, or perhaps just to facilitate the overarching trading or faction quests, it makes a lot of sense to assume that it would also be associated with launching the Hermes 13. What isn't speculation, however, is that the player would then also need to track down a special docking clamp chip. It's easy to miss this detail because it's not actually mentioned in the Bloomfield design document. It's mentioned in design document number 7, Mesa Verde. Essentially, the Hermes 13 was locked in place on the launch pad, and attempting to launch it without disengaging the docking clamps would cause it to explode and instantly kill the player and everyone else on board. To preferably prevent this from happening, the player would have to travel back to Mesa Verde to pay a visit to the Cipher tribe. If the player hadn't already dealt with the Mesa Verde questline, they would now need to do so. Afterwards, they would encounter a special new NPC, a member of the Cipher tribe named Sim, a trader of valuable pre-war goods, who was also their only source for that particular schematic. As usual, the details are scarce, but the Mesa Verde document mentions that Sim's attitude toward the player would be influenced by how the player had resolved the Mesa Verde questline. If they had saved or were otherwise on good terms with the tribe, then Sim would happily trade with the player. But if the tribe had been wiped out or otherwise disliked the player, then it would be a much more antagonistic interaction, possibly requiring the player to take the schematics by force. Afterwards, the player would also presumably need to build the chip. It is just a schematic after all, which they could either presumably farm out to appropriate NPCs or handle personally if they had the appropriate skills and resources required. Finally, that brings us to what may be one of the most intriguing and mysterious steps that the player would have to complete to actually get to B.O.M.B 1. They would need to travel to the Grand Canyon, find the remains of B.O.M.B 2, where it had landed after falling out of orbit, and retrieve the space station's computer core. This gets into some weird territory, because we really don't have a lot to go on here. There is no design document for the Grand Canyon, not one that was leaked anyway. All we have is some concept art, some vague information dropped in various interviews, and a selection of partial dialogue that was data mined from the original Van Buren tech demo. The implication, and again this gets into some pretty hefty speculation, is that in order to either navigate to B.O.M.B 1 or to successfully dock with it, the player would need data that they could only find on the B.O.M.B 2 computer core. In order to get this core, they would need to travel to the Grand Canyon, find some way to get to the bottom, contend with traps and radiation, make their way past cannibalistic mutants, and finally deal with a hit squad sent by Victor Presper himself to stop the player from interfering in his plans. There's a lot to unpack here, even with just the partial information that we do have, so I think we'll save that for a future video. Suffice to say, regardless of how they were intended to get it, or what exactly it was supposed to do, the player would need that computer core. An interesting side note there, and again this is mostly speculation on my part, is that this is where the mysterious B.O.M.B 3 terminal may have been intended to come into play. I very briefly mentioned in the previous videos that B.O.M.B 3, never completed and left partially assembled in the Bloomfield rocket assembly hangar, was connected to a single functional terminal. It's possible that this was intended to serve as a potential alternate source for whatever data the player needed from the B.O.M.B 2 computer core. But again, we have no way of really knowing. It's just something that really jumped out at me as I was trying to make sense of all this partial and unfinished content. It's just as likely that this mystery terminal would have given the player even more lore, or some sort of secret schematics, or any number of other minor bonuses or rewards for getting the Bloomfield generator up to maximum power efficiency. Now, with all that said and done, with all the MacGuffins collected and mission control repaired and properly staffed, the player would finally be ready to launch the Hermes 13 and proceed to the game's final planned encounter. The only remaining potential hurdle that the player would need to contend with was which companions, if any, would accompany them to B.O.M.B 1. The document stresses that, as far as the player and his companions know, this would essentially be a one-way suicide mission. While there are in fact escape pods on B.O.M.B. that can be used to safely return to Earth after the final confrontation with Presper, the player would have no way of knowing this in advance. Some companions would still be willing to accompany the player, others would have to be convinced, and some would adamantly refuse unless somehow forced, and even if they were forced, it would lead to awkward situations once they were actually up there. The main limitation here is that there are only 6 seats on the Hermes XIII, enough space for the player and up to 5 of their companions. This seems to be a very deliberate limitation because the actual B.O.M.B. design document indicates that there are only enough escape pods for up to 10 people. Depending on how things play out once the player's up there, up to 4 of those slots could be taken by NPCs who are already present on B.O.M.B. That would leave just barely enough pods for the player and his up to 5 companions to safely evacuate the station afterwards. And that is just about it. That is the penultimate quest planned for Fallout Van Buren. In order to fully prep the Hermes XIII for launch, and to safely make it to their final destination, the player would need to collect at least 4 vital components, requiring them to visit and potentially complete at least 3 major in-game locations. Given all this complexity, it's actually a little surprising to see that there were only 4 potential end slides planned for the Bloomfield Space Center. The first and most basic epilogue was that everyone would just end up dead, and Bloomfield would be abandoned. This would obviously happen if the player just walked in and mowed down the rusty hooks, but it would also happen if the player left Kyle the Hook in charge, because he would eventually get both himself and his entire gang killed. This would actually be reflected in-game if a full 6 months passed with Kyle left in charge. In that case, the next time the player visited Bloomfield, they would find the rusty hooks dead and Kyle's head mounted on a fence post out front. If the player ended the game before this happened, but with Kyle still in charge, it would instead trigger Epilogue 4, which was basically just a variant of Epilogue 1. Everyone would still end up dead, the image would be the same, but the epilogue would explain that it was due to Kyle's bad leadership. Although not specified, it is possible that this might have also been the inevitable consequence of resolving the Rusty Hook's quest in a way that left Kyle dead, but also prompted Bear to abandon the rest of the gang. It does get a little hazy here, because Bear obviously had feelings for Jillian and was friends with Sid, so the idea that he would just abandon them seems unlikely. It's possible that those characters were intended to accompany Bear back to Hoover Dam if the gang fell apart, but we have no real way of knowing that. Epilogue number 2 involved the destruction of the entire Bloomfield facility. This would only happen if the player deliberately decided to nuke Bloomfield from orbit. An odd decision, but certainly not beyond the realm of possibility. It was entirely possible that at least some missiles would end up being launched before the player could thwart Presper's plan, in which place the player would need to decide where those missiles would go. It's also entirely possible that the player would simply go mad with power, or decide to enact a vendetta against any number of factions in the Wastelands, in which case they could deliberately launch the missiles themselves and target locations like Bloomfield. And in that case, the entire facility and everyone in it would be annihilated. Nothing would be left but a radioactive crater. There's not really much else to say here. I mean, what would you expect? In fact, of the 4 listed epilogues, only one ended on a positive note. If the player convinced Bear to take over the Rusty Hooks, then it would trigger Epilogue number 3. This would describe how Bear managed to turn Bloomfield into a thriving and prosperous community. Still, it is worth noting that there do seem to be at least a few other potential end conditions that aren't actually covered by this very basic assortment of end slides. For example, there are no end slides describing what might happen if the player took over the gang and converted Bloomfield into a trading post, or pushed the Rusty Hooks to become even deadlier and more efficient raiders. There's no mention made of what happens if Bear ends up abandoning the Rusty Hooks, as can happen in many of the resolutions for the main Rusty Hook arc, and there's no mention made of what might happen if the player hands control of Bloomfield over to the Brotherhood of Steel, the NCR, or the Reservation. all of those are scenarios that would presumably result in some very different post-game consequences. At any rate, that finally concludes our 3-year analysis of the Bloomfield design document, which also puts us right on the cusp of finally wrapping up this series. We've really just got one leaked document left, number 16, which covers Bomb 1 and the final fateful confrontation with Victor Presper. Beyond that, I will note that there are some other potentially interesting things to chatter about. There's an alternate version of design document number 10, for example, which describes the Mormon community of New Canaan. That's an interesting one, because it was marked almost in its entirety for deletion sometime in mid-development, replaced with the Jericho desalination plant, which we have previously talked about. There are also a number of other locations that, sadly, we have no reliable documents for, places like Circle Junction, Fort Abandon, the Grand Canyon, and a few other oddball locations like Cheyenne Mountain Crater, Mole Town, and even Vault 69, which, let's be honest, was probably just an inside joke that wasn't actually intended to make it into the final game. While I may end up touching on a few of these locations in the future, the unfortunate reality is that in most of these cases, we just don't really have a lot to go on. But I suppose that's something for future Retcon to worry about. For now, this is Present Retcon signing off. Thanks for listening. And remember, although I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, you can find out more about what could have been over on the fan-run wikis and the old No Mutants Allowed archives. If you'd like to help support the channel and encourage me to spend even more time rambling about a game that was officially cancelled almost 2 decades ago, then feel free to push the buttons that do the things, or maybe even check out the Patreon. As always, links are in the description.